My guest today is Otakar Hubshcmann. Otakar runs the Applied Data Group at Trains Re, a global reinsurance company. The group seeks to monetize information through data science and machine learning. Otakar's background is in portfolio management and trading at international banks and hedge funds. Otakar, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here, David.
So first question. It seems to me that there are two strategies in AI and machine learning, in my experience. The first is to kind of automate things at scale, so things that humans can do. And I think of this image recognition being an important thing, which machines allow us to look at video and analyze it and understand it without a person actually looking at things, which is valuable. The second is to teach us things by processing more data than humans could. And so this can be done at scale as well. For instance, with recommendation engines where the AI can observe lots of things and actually infer meaning where a human would not be able to do. But I think these are distinct sources of value. And so first, you can agree or disagree with that premise. And second, where does AI add value in reinsurance?
Well, good, big, broad question to start. AI, broadly speaking, or machine learning, which is like a subtext of AI, is broken up into supervised and unsupervised learning. So the thing you're talking about when you give a computer pictures of dogs or cats is called supervised learning. They learn from examples that are shown and labeled. And we actually do this whenever you do one of those CAPTCHAs, where to prove you're not a robot, you're actually helping some AI somewhere, an ML algorithm, better label pictures for use in something, for the Borg.
Right.
And the other one is unsupervised, and that's more like you throw a bunch of data at it, you don't say anything about what the data represents, and you use the machine learning algorithms to cluster the data and sort of try to separate the data into different groups. And then you would look back on the data and say, these groups look similar because of these reasons, and these groups are separated for these reasons. So those, broadly speaking, are the two things. But yeah, I think the big main advantages of ML machine learning in any industry, but certainly potential applications in insurance and reinsurance, are to make decisions at scale and better optimize decisions that would take a much longer time, having been funneled through a human. So at the heart of any machine learning algorithm is some function. It's usually a loss function you're trying to optimize for. So you're trying to improve upon an error rate. The idea of that the machine learns is because you show it more data and the optimization becomes better and better given more data. And if the hope is that if the algorithm can generalize information about a data set, then you can provide a new data set in the real world, what's called an out-of-sample data set, and then the model and the algorithm will be able to generalize on that data. So broadly speaking, that's sort of it. Yeah, scale is a huge thing, and just better decision-making at a much larger scale, optimization of a number of different things.
So in reinsurance, though, here's the thing that I see about that business, right? Because it's super, super highly capable experts looking at masses of data, right? Making decisions on that data. And where does the machine squeeze in to that process to add something to it?
Yeah, so that brings up a good point, something that I always, whenever I give my, Skynet is not going to take over talk or speech to underwriters or whatever line of business, the idea that you could have a machine come in or an algorithm, set of algorithms or whatever, take over from someone that's been in the industry with a learned domain expertise and a set of heuristics that are sort of proven over time, that just is not going to happen maybe ever, but certainly not for many, many years. So the way I've always thought about it is when you think of, Gary Kasparov played Big Blue, famous grandmaster in chess, lost to Big Blue, which was an IBM computer program, big deep search algorithm. And after that experience, he had always said that, he thought that the most optimal setup would not be either like chess master or machine. It would be chess master aided with machine, sort of a bionic, middle place. And I've always thought that you have sort of like the scaling, again, back to I thought that was a good broad, scaling and optimization algorithms and process. And then sitting on top of that is you have the domain expert, the actuary, the underwriter, the finance person, the risk manager, whatever line of business. So the machine learning enables those individuals to take their domain expertise and like apply it to a larger scale, so they can make more decisions, better decisions, much faster than they could previously. So it isn't a matter of business being taken away from the human. It's enabling the human to scale up their business.
Okay, so this is more the expansion scaling then side of things, right? Than teaching people, or is it more teaching people? What do you think?
I think it's initially probably more scaling, but the idea is that the feedback you get from the algorithms is sort of like, I always think about it, different features or attributes to like a cert policy or treaty equal either some claims or not claims, whether, you have severe claims, number of frequent claims, whatever. So over time, you will get to see what attributes make up good pieces of business and what attributes make up, bad business. So I think initially it's probably the scaling thing, but I think the idea is very powerful that you could take, again, like the inborn learned heuristics that, say, for instance, underwriters have when they're trading and underwriting, and couple that with new insights that are gleaned from the machine learning algorithms telling you, maybe you haven't seen this before, but this particular combination of business yields, an outsized good return or an outsized bad return. So then they can begin to sort of make them into their, set of like sort of more qualitative heuristics.
Do they buy it? You know what I mean? Like, I gotta think if you're, I mean, I know a lot of underwriters, right? As do you. Some of them are pretty old school, and I imagine would be a little bit, let's call them Luddites. It's a bit of negative kind of connotation to that, but I could see them resisting and saying, yeah, right. That's wrong.
Yeah. So, what I found, I've been at Transre 4 years now, and what I found is like probably what you would expect is a pretty broad spectrum of those that buy in right away because they see the value. And then sort of in the middle ground, it's those that buy in, but only if the machine learning results or the algorithmic results sort of tell them the story that they want to hear.
Right, yeah.
Validate, right, exactly. So, and then on the other side, like you said, it's sort of like, hey, listen, I've been doing this for however many decades. There's nothing that a machine could tell me that I wouldn't already know. And I respect that. And, my background coming from trading, I know that again, I keep on calling it like the heuristic piece, but like the rules of thumb piece is super important. That gut sense, I do believe is something, but it can be, again, like better optimized. Like, so the idea that you would make better decisions using your gut. So it's like algorithmically gut-made decisions, which would avoid more mistakes. To me, intuitively, that would be like a pretty cool thing. But to your point, there's definitely a spectrum, and I think insurance is in a phase right now, probably spurred on by the pandemic, where people are like, this is happening. It's coming down the line. I used to always say jokingly, winter is coming in terms of the necessity. It's not going to become it won't be a choice. Like at a certain point, it will be, have you been using data-enabled machine learning tools, and have you tried to mine and monetize your data? And so that will be happening in the background, and there will become a certain point where people are going to wake up and be like, oh no, all these other companies were doing that. and they have such a head start on us. And now that everyone's saying it's important and we're beginning to, algorithmically automate the more homogeneous data sets, there will be a point, like I said, and it'll be weirdly very gradual, and then it'll become binary. It sounds like I'm talking about the singularity, but I'm saying like one day people will wake up and say, man, I'm really glad we started doing that like 5 years ago, or, oh no, we didn't do that 5 years ago, and now, we have a lot of catch up.
I think of like two thoughts come to mind. One is, what way that actually manifests itself. Like, suddenly your results are a little worse, and you're having trouble figuring out why other people are doing better, and you just sort of, you just didn't pick the right deals and didn't get big enough lines on the right ones. And those are the reinsurers actually don't have that many decision points, right? It's, particularly in an open market, subscription market, you can some private deals, I suppose, but for the most part, it's like, do you go overweight or underweight, right, on this or that treaty?
Right. I think that, initially what I've seen is that it will be spurred on by people being worried about the fear of missing out, the dreaded FOMO. So they're going to hear that, and I already sort of see it with third-party companies trying to come in and sell us stuff, whether it's data ingestion tools or sort of like algorithmic trading of underwriting lines, stuff like that. I've seen in my short time in insurance that, companies are sort of spurred to action in this area because they see other companies doing it, and they're worried that they're going to be either they're going to have to present to management and they don't have anything to show, and the management is going to say, hey, why? I heard that they're starting to do this thing at another company, and why aren't we doing it? But yeah, there's such a huge spectrum of how it plays out. It's very hard to say, but like I said, what I've seen so far is that it's spurred on by the fear of missing out. And then it's like sort of catch up. And we have some of that going on in the pandemic with some of the, automation things, I think, within the industry.
That's interesting. It speaks to maybe the delay between any strategy that gets implemented and how long before you really see real results from it, right? Because, you think like if you're a mature company like Trans and you have a portfolio of a bunch of deals you're on, right? And like how hard are you really going to yank the wheel no matter what happens, right? No matter what new information you get, how hard can you really yank the wheel? Because there's always this unknown unknowns thing to it. And, and you're sitting around the underwriting committee saying, oh, let's just get off all these deals and get on all these ones. And it's like, whoa,
right.
Just that's not how the world works here.
Right.
And so you have to make decisions on kind of secondary measures of quality, right? Which, I remember when I was a reinsurance broker, it was kind of amazing. You sort of have at all levels, everybody, have a bit of a herd mentality where somebody goes up publicly saying, hey, we did this as an organization. And now you, CEO, on the other side, have to answer your shareholders and decide why you have not done such a thing. So why are they wrong? Because you never know what's going to work for years.
Exactly.
You have to go in a strategic direction.
It's bizarre, but it is that's a good way to describe it. I think it is herd mentality because I've seen, you see some of these insurtechs, in the industry that have been very well funded. And then when they come in, they talk to us almost all the time. They have an idea that is at the very nascent stages of anything. And yet they've been funded, and I think that is in part, again, to the fear of missing out thing. So they'll come in and they have, the Wall Street Journal article says that they have the algorithm to change the industry, but then when you ask them, they say, well, you know what, to be honest, between us, it's not really an algorithm so much as it is some like rules-based things, but like we're going to work on the algorithm, and like guess what, we just got like $300 million, so that's actually not something we have to worry about. So there's that, which I think is sort of inherent in a lot of startups anyway. The sort of, I don't want to say fake it till you make it, but like you don't have the product you're saying until you have the funding to have the product you're saying. And I think to to your earlier point, there does need to be some, whether it's like not a direct bifurcation of, so this is our business that we underwrite with all our usual qualitative things, and this is the business we do algorithmically. Like, I don't know if it's even going to be that harsh. I think there, like you said, there needs to be some gradual spin-off towards the road less taken, where even if you could, so this would be one scenario where you could incubate, you have, you look at the same deals, and you have the underwriter do their same processes, but at the same time, you can have the algorithm or whatever you want to call it. It sounds very sentient, but it's just like whatever. It's like you have the secret sauce recipe working on those same deals unbeknownst to the underwriter, and then you present the findings after whatever, a year or 18 months. And then that's a much, sort of more quantitative thing where this is how we did it / do it currently. This is how we could be doing it in the future. Are there any things to glean from the way that the machine did it in a strictly quantitative basis versus our qualitative basis? So that's the way I sort of see it playing out. I mean, like, to your point, I certainly wouldn't want to sit in front of our board and say, hey, good news, guys, or bad news, guys. We turned the key and like the building exploded. Like it's sort of does need to be gradual, and there does need to be a base established, I think, so that you can do a comparative testing versus the way that things are currently done. I mean, that's the only way I believe that you get a true sustainable buy-in, is doing the two things like concurrently and then comparing how they do against each other. And that's like one of the good things about the doing, say, underwriting an algorithmic way is that, once the model is up and running, you can take that version of the model, because I used to do it in trading all the time, and then you tweak that model like 5, 10, 15, 20 different ways. And so they all spin out and they incubate at the same time, and they're all running in the background, sort of like paper trading, right? Not spending real money, and then you can take the one that does the best, or you can do some optimization across all of them to have them be an ensemble where basically all the models vote on, so you could do, there's a number of different ways. And again, it's not like you're hiring more people. Like this, I said, you can do, one model or 20 models is like the same price.
Yeah. There's an image in my mind of thinking about model kind of like multiplicity, I guess, where right now, like a typical reinsurance company, you have this underwriting committee, right, or whatever it is. So you'll have 5 or 6 super experienced professionals in the hierarchy, and they sit down around a table virtually or physically, and they just go through the deals and they talk about them. They say, well, I like this one, that one, and give me the pitch. Jimmy, this is your deal. Susan, that's your deal. We go Jimmy's first, Susan's next. And then they just sort of hash it out at the table, right? And they talk about whether they want to do it or not, or how much they want to do, and they come up with an outcome, right? And so that's like 6 or 7 models working there in people's heads.
Right.
And now maybe you just add another one, or maybe you add 50, or I don't know, 2 billion, or whatever number of models you can put in that chair, the AI chair. Is that a proper vision for how this could work?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to articulate it. And the idea, is that say we have one nice base model. And again, so I guess to contextualize a little bit. So when we talk about model, it's like we take historical data, so it would be, again, the 2 parts of the equation. It's like the cert, treaty, policy information, and the claims information, and we're basically trying to divine what pieces on the left hand of the equation equal the pieces on the right hand of the equation. And so we throw a number of algorithms at it, Then we like optimize for like the knobs and buttons on those algorithms. We try to make sure it's not overfitting, and overfitting is a big problem in machine learning. But what that means is the algorithm remembers and learns the data set it trains on so well that when it sees a new data set, it's like very brittle and it breaks. It doesn't model well on a new data set. And we need an algorithm to be able to generalize. So the way I see it is you get your good, first number one secret sauce algorithm, and then you can spin that out to 15 or 20, and they all have, like I said, slightly different tweaks of the knobs, slightly different emphasis or weightings of different attributes. And then collectively what those models can do sitting in the AI chair is that they can say, when we accentuate different aspects of the underwriting process or things that we think are important, whether it's like emphasis on premium per, what the limit is or where you're attaching or where the sector is, collectively from like those 20 models, they may all broadly work and return sort of the same results, but we'll get an interesting tail from each of the models where we can see outliers that would help us to, broadly speaking, make better decisions going forward.
Let's come back to chess for a sec. Now, I don't want to overdo the chess metaphor because that's a closed system with certain rules, right? And there's like a finite number of decisions you can make in chess. It's a big number, but it's a finite number. And so you could, in theory, memorize the chess training set, right? And you could solve the entire chess game. But Gary, you made a distinction earlier on supervised and unsupervised. So Gary Kasparov and the supervised learning Deep Blue. So they fed it a whole bunch of stuff that people had done in the past, and examples of things that were good games. And then they have, along comes Alpha Zero, right? Which simply gets the rules of chess and plays itself for, I don't know, like a couple days or something.
Right.
Like, millions of games. And now it's like an alien intelligence.
Right.
Right. So now the thing is teaching humans how to play chess, and they can't imagine, even before then, chess had exceeded human capability. But now, like, this whole world, and it's inspiring. I don't know if you've seen this stuff, but it's kind of neat to sort of see like how it just plays the game in a different way. And it shows maybe there's some path dependence to how humans have learned the game, and there could be alternate realities that we could have learned. And so, like, here's like, this other, like I said, an alien intelligence, like from another universe. And can you approach, could you imagine an algorithm, unsupervised manner, learning reinsurance in this kind of way? Let's break this kind of model here of chess versus insurance.
Yeah.
Can it be done? Something more ambitious than our chair with 20 models in it. Yeah.
So I think what you're sort of talking to is, so the AlphaGo Zero, the multiple variations of the alpha, of what I believe it's Google Mind is doing, where each of the algorithms that are based towards games get increasingly better at learning, even without, I believe some of them, they don't even give them the rules of the games. And they're able to, again, like, so the example was in this case, I believe, was in Go, and the model started beating all the Korean champions. And there was a point at which in one of the games, the computer model made what the Go experts considered like an achingly beautiful move. And I believe this talks to your idea of, is there a point, the idea of general AI when computers can pass the Turing test and they can do things that aren't so rote, and they become very nuanced, and in like the case of Go, what many of the experts and masters had considered like a beautiful move sort of out of nowhere. My short answer to that would be, I don't know, but one of the things I worry about sitting in my seat, my job, my role at TransRe is that somewhere in their garage or at a huge company, somebody completely unrelated to anything having to do with insurance or reinsurance is playing around with something where they can transfer that to the insurance and reinsurance industry, and where they basically say, well, we figured it out, everybody, and then all of a sudden there's a sea change in the industry. So I definitely think there's a chance of that happening. Again, whether it's one of these huge companies like Google or Amazon, or whether it's somebody super smart tinkering around with a certain type of transfer, machine learning, or whatever in their basement or their garage. So to my mind, that's the idea that we could do, call it beautiful, artistic underwriting. That's something I'm like excited about more than fearful. But like I said, from a job security perspective, I'm probably sort of fearful that somebody is working on it, something completely orthogonal to insurance that all of a sudden works extremely well in underwriting.
Yeah, I wonder, I'm probably a little less worried than you. I think that I see so much of the value of really, really high quality insurance and reinsurance underwriters. I have a little more experience in reinsurance, is their knowledge of the market, their ability to figure out who's going to screw them, right?
Right.
And understand maybe their own kind of weaknesses as humans to make decisions, right? And so underwriting committee's there to kind of smooth out cognitive bias for individuals and bring in greater knowledge and maybe greater relationships to sort of know who are the bad guys, who are the good guys. And I think that if you had kind of perfect information about kind of like whether somebody is trying to, think about like the structure of reinsurance deals, like they're just so designed, and even the culture of people talk in the reinsurance industry, it's all designed to stamp out moral hazard. Like it's all designed to say, you have two giant financial institutions who are the most sophisticated thing that they really want to get into is the quota share. And it's like, these are very smart people, who should be able to think of something a little more complex than, half of it's mine and half of it's yours. But the problem is like their desire, their fear of moral hazard is so strong that that's where they're most financially competitive. And cause it's so easy for somebody to game other people using a different method. And so like, to me, like the technology, the revolutionary that you're describing there would need to find a way to communicate to somebody when they're getting screwed better. Because I see that as the secret sauce of underwriting. And unless a machine can somehow unearth, some kind of trust-o-meter, like you should trust this MGA startup selling long-haul trucking and not that one, then, that to me would be pretty amazing. But I have a hard time, envisioning computers, machines being better at figuring out good people and bad people. But maybe, I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that is a good point. The am I getting swindled meter. So what you're speaking to is that, machines they don't do well with the human-y things, with the behavioral aspects of the things. And again, I wouldn't, when it comes to the final decision for a deal, and it's like between somebody who's been in the industry 20 or 30 years and something that a computer is spitting out, I certainly would go with a human. However, I think that things work and the status quo works until the status quo suddenly does not work. And I saw that in a number of different things in trading and Wall Street, whatever, when I was working there. One example was how sacrosanct the idea of a certain level of commission rates were for doing trades. And you even see that now. I think the company Robinhood began to, the idea that you could not charge for executing trades was anathema to the entire industry. And people had basically predicated their entire careers upon that rule. And it was, I remember when I first got in, people would say to me that reinsurance was a gentleman's game. And I always thought that was, man, what a slippery slope that is. Everybody agrees on the rules until somebody doesn't agree on the rules and finds a better way to do it. And then it's a race to the bottom. And what I mean in this particular context is, Robinhood says there's going to be 0 commissions for trading. And I saw that same type of thing when I'm old enough to remember when there used to be the idea of you could only charge in specific increments for trades. I believe the lowest was 1/16th, which we called a teeny. And then things went to digital and you could charge whatever you wanted. But prior to that, the idea that we would go to digital where you could bring it out a number of decimal places and charge as low as that was crazy. So the idea that, again, you can execute a trade for ostensibly for free, although those companies are receiving money from other companies for that order flow that they deliver. Again, that had been anathema to the industry, but then the paradigm changed and the gentleman's game in that aspect completely broke. And I think insurance, reinsurance is rife for that type of stuff, and it's fine until it isn't fine.
When you're saying they get paid for the order flow, I only kind of imperfectly understand that business. You mean that the monetization strategy changed for those companies, those intermediaries?
Yeah, so to the extent that I hopefully understand it okay, so a company like Robinhood will receive retail orders, and then a company like Citadel or one of these other quantitative trading places, they will pay Robinhood to see that order flow so they can get a better sense of the book size. We call the book is the bid and ask for a particular stock, right? So the book size, where things are trending. And so that the Citadel or the quantitative hedge funds are paying for the information to help improve their picture of the market. And to help improve their liquidity. So, yeah, those are the types of things like I think about what are the analogs in insurance reinsurance, how one of the things, and I hope it's not too controversial, but I always was so interested / curious about why the industry was so dependent upon intermediaries and brokerage houses, because I had sort of seen that dwindle and diminish on Wall Street, where, I used to be covered by 5 or 7 people at a firm to give me, information about a deal or whatever, if I was doing like, say, M&A trading or, whatever the vertical was. And then I saw it go to 3 people, and then it went down to 1 people. And I've always wondered how I'm pretty sure the fat in the distribution system, there's so much fat, and so many seeming inefficiencies that it's rife to be disrupted. And, you have an interesting situation because like the people that are going to be disrupted are like the actual lobby fighting against the disruption. So they're the underwriters, the brokers, the whoever transacting. So there is, collusion is the wrong word, but there is a huge impetus and incentive to keep things status quo. And so that is, that plays to the reticence of the adoption, certainly like for the stuff in my job, like the lobbying arm are the actual people that you're trying to help, with the tools that you're building.
Yeah, that's interesting. So where do you get ideas for what you do? How what's the roadmap? Like, how does that come about? Do you look elsewhere outside of the industry? Like, where does the plan come for this at Trans? Where do you get inspiration?
Well, I think so. I've always been a big proponent of sort of orthogonal application of things I've learned from other areas, whether it's, whatever, science, physics, business. Certainly I come to things with a trader's mindset, having traded my whole career before TransRe. So I think about, again, very directly, how do you monetize information? There is, generally speaking, always going to be incomplete information. So how do you jump to make that step in the monetization of the incomplete picture? And, the inspiration for me, so when it would work when I was trading, the idea that you could take a thought of yours where you thought there was a potential arbitrage opportunity, or there was an inequality between like two data sets or something that somebody else hadn't found, and that the alpha or the edge hadn't been whittled away. So when you took that and you made that into a model, and then to see that make money, it is a really alchemic thing. And somebody had said that my group, they thought were sort of, what my group did was sort of alchemy. And it's funny because alchemy is like a little bit of a disparagement, but not when you think that alchemy was the beginnings of many of the things in chemistry and the sciences. And to somebody that doesn't understand the innards and the whatever black box, which I totally believe should be not obfuscated, and they should be seen by everybody. The idea that you can, again, I'm saying idea, taking an idea, putting it into a model, the model works to find the inefficiencies, acts on that idea, and you can make money from that, is fantastic. And it's like, I go back to, I really like Richard Feynman, the Nobel physicist, and he always would say the pleasure of finding things out was what drove him. And so to me, I feel very much in the same way, where a new idea for anything, I remember I had an idea for one of my best performing trading strategies I got from talking to somebody at a Motley Crue concert. And the idea popped into my head. So the being able to apply information from all aspects of your life, seeking out interesting people to talk to them, reading all over and broadly, trying to find conversations that, tweak your brain, scratch your brain in an interesting way. To me, all that can be applied again to what my job, I believe, is, which is monetizing information in different ways. So I feel like I went a little bit on a tangent there, but it comes down to the game to me, which will be infinitely interesting, is taking the ideas, taking thoughts, information, and trying to make money from it.
So I think coming back to sort of the original question, maybe we can kind of close on this sort of thought, or exploring this thought, is if I sort of have become convinced, and you can tell me if I'm right on this or not, that actually it's the exploratory educational side of the algorithmic analysis, AI, machine learning, that is perhaps more interesting at the moment, right? So it's what can we learn about the world that this algorithm can teach us? How do you, and you can disagree with that, of course, but how do you how do you teach somebody with such a thing? Because they'll say, you're going to say, you should turn this deal down. And the algorithm says, in that chair. And the person says, and the underwriter says, well, why?
Yeah.
What do you know?
That's a great question.
How do you answer that question? How does the algorithm? How do you design the output to be interpreted?
That's a great question. I think you don't pretend that your information or the information you've received from your model is any better than theirs. So it's basically like, so we will build a model, and the model will spit out what's called feature importances. It will say, hey, you should be looking at this particular sector, this level of rate, this level of limit, attachment, things like that. And so I will go back to the underwriter and I'll say, okay, so for this deal or for your portfolio, it's told me that these things were important. these were areas in which the decision tree algorithm, one of the nodes broke off and went to another thing, so that the decisions were predicated upon that specific attribute. And I will say, first of all, does this intuitively make sense to you? And if not, why? And I will basically ask them to do what in effect is the human CAPTCHA, where I say, I need you to help me, for lack of a better term, label your portfolio. So you have to say to me, this would be considered a strange piece of business, except in the notes, you'll notice that I have these 3 or 4 things. So I take those 3 or 4 things, and then they become new attributes to make the model better. So, you take, again, sort of generalized model, and then you try to be very considerate about including all the sort of heuristic tweaks that would be incongruent with the model, but actually in real life sort of makes sense because you're taking into account the qualitative expertise of the underwriter or whoever the professional is.
It's interesting. So in a sense, you're forcing them to stand by their guidance to you and saying, well, over here on this model, on this deal over there, you trained it with this information, and it's just really giving you back that right. Insight, but in a different place.
Exactly. So as for instance, we build out a model that takes, it was trained on a huge history of our fact business, and it will take certs, and it will say, based on previous business, you are this percentage likely to write this again. So when I show that to the underwriters, the idea is that, say they get 20, however many, 30 pieces of certs a day that they need to potentially look at. So we'll provide them with the top N certs saying you're most likely to write these, so on and so forth all the way down. So they can sort of, again, it's to help scale and optimize the decision making. And when I show these to the underwriters and they say, no, this is wrong. Like it says I would write this, 95% of the time. We didn't write this deal. And I say, okay, well, why didn't you write the deal? And they'll say, again, like I mentioned before, they'll say, well, this would look like a deal we'd write all the time, except it has this specific little feature to it. So then we'll add the feature into the model. So, with an underwriter that's open to the process, it's really fun and terrific because they can see the value added in terms of making the model better to help them. Again, like you said, they get the feedback from decisions they've made in the past because you're training on what admittedly are the biased, because biased by that I mean everyone has biases in their decision making. So you have trained the model on the biased decisions of the underwriters. So when you feed it back to them, like you said, it's like, well, you made this decision to help infer the model's decision. So now, why did you change your decision? So then, in sort of like a Bayesian sense, Bayesian statistics, you basically just update your decision. Bayesian is like real life, right? You just update your probabilities and your decision making given new information. So like that's what we constantly do with the models to make them be able to generalize better the real world, because you don't want to like a hemophiliac model where like if you cut it in the real world it bleeds out.
Yeah. So last question, I think. How do you measure progress for your efforts from the models or the
Yeah, that's a great question. Coming from an industry where my progress or my cumulative progress could literally be measured with a single black or red number at the end of every day, because I was running a portfolio and I would have P&L every single day. It's been an interesting switch to not having a P&L for my group. And, I remember reading, I think, in one of Nassim Taleb's books, he talks about, maybe it's Black Swan, but he talks about if there had been a person that had created the door latch to prevent the 9/11 hijackings from happening, and that door latch had been created before 9/11, you maybe would have never heard of that person. So it's very hard to, like, in some instances, prove out certain things. So for me, progress to me is probably by how adopted, how open I see people becoming, like the sort of collective thaw of people towards the tools. But hopefully down the line, and not too far away, there's going to be an actual measurement, because we're going to have, automated ML models in production where I can actually see, after some time, how they're doing.
And so looking to the, the future here, what is your kind of priority? Like, what's the thing you're most excited about building and having in play? You're saying a monitoring system. Like, what are some other cool things at the frontier?
Well, all this sort of abstracts away one of the huge issues in the industry, which is data quality is, generally speaking, like terrible. So there is a ton of time spent in trying to get the data across all lines standardized in the way that it's brought into the company through TAs or whatever, how it's ingested, how then it's cleaned, how we have the name matching so we can follow and ensure it all the way through the process. So there's still work to be done. We've made a lot of progress in that, but there's certainly still work to be done to build a very strong foundational sort of data base, not in the database sense, but like an actual basal data set, to be able to do the more sexy algorithmic things on top of that. But what I see down the line is, again, like if you have a spectrum of like homogeneous data, heterogeneous data that is in lines of business, we begin to monetize the more homogeneous data sets and lines of business. But at the same time, I believe that like in the data sets that are going to be harder to model, there's probably going to be very interesting opportunities in that, because there'll be sort of more of an arbitrage with the more heterogeneous, like bespoke data set. So down the line for me, it would definitely be, broadly speaking, automation of a number of the services, and algorithmic underwriting of certain lines, and just, a very speedy, scalable, at your fingers, way to look at your portfolio, and just make better decisions, more decisions in faster amount of time.
My guest today is Otakar Hubshcmann. Otakar, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Great talking to you.